The year 1878 pushed a dry, hot breath across the high plains where the Arizona and New Mexico territories bled into one another. Willow Creek was less a town than a scar, carved by the railroad and baked into the red earth. Dust was the first and last thing you knew of the place. It was a fine, rust-colored powder that coated every board of the unpainted buildings, settled in the wrinkles of a man's face, and gave the air a permanent taste of grit. The train whistle was the town's heartbeat, a shrill, metallic cry that announced the arrival of civilization, or at least its raw materials. Twice a day it screamed, and twice a day the town held its breath, waiting to see what trouble or meager hope it would deposit on the splintered platform. Ash Nez stood in the sliver of shade offered by the livery stable, his gaze sweeping the street with an economy of movement that was part of his nature. He had the stillness of the mesas, a quality that made other men uneasy. He was Dine, a Navajo, and his face was a map of the lands he knew: high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that held the deep, patient darkness of a canyon at dusk. He had once been a scout for the army, a life that taught him the ways of the white man's war and left a bitter taste in his mouth. Now he was a trail guide, a hunter, a man who sold his knowledge of the unforgiving land to those who could not read it themselves. It was a living, nothing more. It was supposed to be simple. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal from the blacksmith's forge and the richer, heavier scent of beef fat sizzling in a pan outside the Blue Lantern Saloon. Josiah Pike, the saloon's proprietor, believed a hungry man was a thirsty man, and the aroma was a potent form of advertising. Ash was waiting for a man, a lawyer with a railroad pin on his lapel and sweat on his brow. The job was an escort, the lawyer had said in a hushed tone, as if the dust itself had ears. A simple job. Take a woman to Santa Fe. Ash had learned long ago that when a man in a suit called a job simple, it was bound to be anything but. Then he saw her, Abigail Turner. She walked with a purpose that defied the oppressive heat, her back straight, her head held high. She was the town's schoolteacher and the blacksmith's daughter, a woman who had buried her father a year prior and had run the schoolhouse with a firm but gentle hand ever since. She wore a plain, high-collared dress the color of a dusty sky, practical and devoid of the fripperies other women favored. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned in a severe bun that allowed no stray strands to escape. The men who loafed on the porch of the general store fell silent as she passed, their lazy gossip replaced by knowing smirks. They had a name for her, spoken in whispers and snickers, the Virgin of Willow Creek. It was a label born of her reserved demeanor, her unwavering dedication to her work, and her polite but firm refusal of any and all advances. The name was meant as a kind of mockery, a branding of her as something strange, an untouched curiosity in a world where survival often demanded compromise. But Abigail Turner wore their whispers like armor. She knew they spoke not of what they knew of her heart, but of what they did not. She carried a heavy leather satchel, and her knuckles were white where she gripped the handle. She did not look at the men on the porch, nor did she acknowledge Ash in the shadows. Her focus was entirely on the door of the Blue Lantern Saloon, which she entered without hesitation. It was not a place for a woman of her reputation, and that fact alone sharpened Ash's senses. The simple job was growing more complicated by the second. He pushed himself off the wall and followed her, the batwing doors sighing shut behind him. The saloon was dim and smelled of stale beer, sawdust, and tension. The lawyer, a man named Sterling, was seated at a corner table, his face pale. Abigail Turner stood beside the table, placing her satchel firmly on its surface. She looked at Ash as he approached, and for the first time, he saw her eyes clearly. They were a startling shade of green, like moss in a shaded canyon, and they held no fear, only resolve. "Mr. Nez," Sterling said, his voice a little too loud. "Thank you for coming. This is Miss Turner." Ash gave a slight nod. "Ma'am?" "Mr. Nez," she replied. her voice clear and steady. "The arrangement is as we discussed," Sterling continued, sliding a small, heavy canvas bag across the table. "Half now, half upon your arrival in Santa Fe. You will see to Miss Turner's safety. It is a matter of some family delicacy." Ash ignored the money. He looked from the nervous lawyer to the composed schoolteacher. What kind of delicacy requires a guide who knows how to handle more than just a horse? Sterling's collar seemed to tighten. "Precaution, the trail can be a dangerous place." Before Abigail could speak, the saloon doors crashed open, slamming against the interior walls with the force of an explosion. 3 men filled the doorway, their figures silhouetted against the blinding afternoon sun. The man in the lead was tall and lean, with a long duster that failed to hide the matched pair of revolvers strapped to his hips. His face was all sharp angles and cruel amusement. Ash knew him by reputation. Cole Ransom, a gun for hire with a soul as barren as the salt flats. The low hum of conversation in the saloon died instantly. Josiah Pike, a man built like one of his own beer barrels, froze behind the bar. His young son, a boy of about 8, peeked out from the kitchen doorway, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fascination. "Well now," Ransom drawled, his eyes sweeping the room and landing on the corner table. "Look what we have here, a lawyer, a lady, and an Indian. It's the start of a bad joke." His men fanned out, their pistols already drawn. Sterling, the lawyer, looked as if he might faint. He shrank back in his chair, making himself small. Ransom's gaze fixed on Abigail's satchel. "I'm here for what you're holding. Teacher, hand it over, and maybe we'll leave the glassware intact." Ash's hand moved slowly, casually, toward the butt of his own revolver. He did not watch Ransom. He watched the other 2 men. One was jittery, his eyes darting around the room. The other was steady, a professional. He was the real threat. "I believe you have the wrong person," Abigail said, her voice betraying not a tremor of fear. "I am merely a schoolteacher." Ransom laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, I know what you are, and I know what's in that bag. Maddox wants his property back." The name hung in the air like gun smoke. Cyrus Maddox, the railroad baron, the man whose iron rails were a steel spine pinning the territory to the Union. A man whose ambition was as vast and rapacious as the land itself. The jittery gunman, emboldened by Ransom's confidence, took a step forward. He gestured with his pistol toward the kitchen doorway, where Josiah Pike's son was still watching. Maybe the boy can convince her to cooperate. It happened faster than Ash could have predicted. As the gunman shifted his aim, a deafening blast tore through the saloon. It wasn't from Ash's gun, nor from Ransom's. The jittery gunman cried out and crumpled to the floor, clutching a shattered knee. Everyone turned to look at Abigail Turner. She stood perfectly still, a small, sawed-off shotgun held expertly in her hands. She had pulled it from her satchel with a speed that belied her prim appearance. Smoke curled from its twin barrels. She hadn't aimed to kill, but to disable. It was a calculated, precise act of violence. The Virgin of Willow Creek was armed. The moment of stunned silence was all Ash needed. He drew his pistol and fired, not at Ransom, but at the large mirror behind the bar. The glass exploded, raining shards down on Josiah Pike, who yelped and scrambled for cover. The distraction worked. Ransom's other man flinched, and Ash was on him in 2 long strides, bringing the barrel of his pistol down hard on the man's wrist. A cry of pain, and the gunman's weapon clattered to the floor. Ransom, recovering his senses, fired a wild shot that splintered the table where Sterling was now hiding. "You'll pay for that. All of you," he snarled. But the element of surprise was gone. "From outside," a man shouted. "What's the commotion?" It was Sheriff Hale, his voice laced with a familiar note of weary reluctance. Ransom knew a prolonged fight in the middle of town was a losing proposition. He gave Abigail a look filled with venomous promise, then backed out the door, dragging his wounded man with him. The other followed, and they disappeared into the blinding sun, leaving behind a wrecked saloon and a shattered sense of peace. Sheriff Hale appeared a moment later, his badge glinting on his dusty vest. He took in the scene, the broken glass, the groaning man on the floor, the smoke still hanging in the air, and Abigail Turner holding a shotgun. His face, already lined with the stress of keeping order on the edge of nowhere, seemed to age another 10 years. "Abigail," he breathed, his voice a mix of disbelief and dismay. He was threatening the boy. "Sheriff," she said simply, her composure absolute. Later, as the sun bled out across the horizon, casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers, Ash met Abigail in the quiet solitude of her father's old forge. The place still smelled of coal smoke and sweat. The rhythmic clang of the hammer was gone, replaced by an unnerving silence. Sheriff Hale had taken the wounded gunman into custody and had asked a great many questions to which Abigail had given very few answers. Sterling, the lawyer, had vanished as if swallowed by the dust. Abigail placed the leather satchel on a heavy wooden workbench. She opened it, but instead of the sawed-off shotgun, she removed a thick, leather-bound ledger. She pushed it toward Ash. He opened it. The pages were filled with neat columns of figures and names. It was a meticulous record of bribes to politicians, payments to gunslingers, and fraudulent land deeds. It was the secret history of how Cyrus Maddox was building his empire, written in black ink and paid for in blood. Ash saw the names of Navajo headmen next to signatures that were clumsy forgeries. He saw parcels of land belonging to Apache bands and small Mexican ranchers, all signed over to front companies owned by the railroad. This was not just a book, it was a weapon. "My father was the town clerk before he devoted all his time to the forge," Abigail explained, her voice low. "He was an honest man, too honest. He saw what Maddox was doing. He started keeping this second ledger, a true one. When he knew he was dying, he gave it to me. He made me promise to get it to an honest judge, a man he knew in Santa Fe." "And the lawyer Sterling?" Ash asked, his eyes still on the damning pages. "He works for Maddox," she said. "I knew that. I thought I could use Maddox's own man to hire a guide, to get me out of Willow Creek without raising suspicion. I did not realize they would move so quickly, so openly." She looked down at her hands. "I have never fired a gun at a man before." "You saved a boy's life," Ash said. It was a simple statement of fact. He looked at her, at the quiet strength that the town mistook for fragility. They called her a virgin, a saint. They had no idea of the iron in her spine. He noticed the simple turquoise bracelet on her wrist, a sliver of blue sky against her skin, a stone his people believed offered protection. "The job Sterling hired me for is a lie," Ash said, closing the ledger. "He wasn't paying me to get you to Santa Fe. He was paying me to lead you into an ambush." "I know," she said. "That is why I'm asking you now. Not as a hired gun, but as a man who understands what is in this book. Will you help me? The fee is still yours, from my own savings." Ash looked at the ledger, a catalogue of the very injustices his people had suffered for generations. This was not about money. It was about Hozo, the dying concept of balance, of walking in beauty and order. Maddox and men like him had thrown the world out of balance. To stand by and do nothing was to accept the chaos. His life as a scout had taught him to follow orders. His life as a dine had taught him to follow his conscience. He pushed the canvas bag of coins back toward her. "Keep your money, schoolteacher. You'll need it." He looked out the open door of the forge into the gathering twilight. The trail to Santa Fe would be long, and it would be hungry. Ransom would be out there, and he would not be alone. The simple job had become a promise, a dangerous one, but it was a promise worth keeping. "I will take you to Santa Fe," Ash Nez said, his voice quiet but resonant in the still air. "We ride at dawn." The pre-dawn air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of dust and the faint, clean smell of the distant river. In the deep shadows of the livery stable, Ash Nez moved with a silent efficiency. his hands checking cinches and saddlebags by feel. The 2 horses, a sturdy buckskin for himself, and a calmer sorrel mare for Abigail, stood patient and ready, their breath plumed in the chill. Henry Carter emerged from the tack room, a lantern held low. He was a broad-shouldered man whose dark skin seemed to soak up the shadows. His movements were as quiet as ashes, a shared language of men who understood that the wilderness demanded observation over conversation. He passed a full canteen to Ash. Ash nodded his thanks, securing it to his saddle. He told Henry that if trouble found them before the Red Mesa Pass, he would double back toward the Painted Bluffs. A fire on the highest bluff would mean they needed a distraction. Henry simply nodded. There was no need for more words. Trust between them had been forged over years of shared trails and unspoken understandings. Henry knew the ways of men like Ransom, and he knew Ash was one of the few who could stand against them. Abigail arrived moments later, a ghost in the gloom. She wore practical buckskin trousers, clearly borrowed, and a heavy wool shirt. The severe schoolteacher was gone, replaced by a woman prepared for the harsh realities of the trail. She carried her satchel, the ledger a heavy weight of responsibility within it. She moved with a stiff grace, her determination a palpable force in the quiet stable. As they led the horses through the sleeping streets of Willow Creek, a figure stepped out from the alley beside the sheriff's office. It was Sheriff Hale, his face a mask of worry in the gray light. He moved with an urgency that betrayed his fear. He told them he could not stop them, and he would not try. He pressed a folded piece of paper into Abigail's hand. It was a telegram, he explained, written in a code he and Judge Miller in Santa Fe had used years ago. He said he could not send it from Willow Creek. The telegraph operator was a man whose loyalty was for sale to the highest bidder, and Cyrus Maddox had the deepest pockets in the territory. The man's dispatches traveled faster than the train. Abigail tucked the paper securely inside her shirt. She thanked the sheriff, her voice low and sincere. Hale just shook his head, his eyes on the long, dark road ahead. He told Ash to keep her safe, a plea from a man caught between the law he wore as a badge and the power that truly ran the town. They rode out as the first hint of orange cracked the eastern horizon, following the gentle curve of the San Juan River. The water, still swollen from late summer rains, was a muddy ribbon of life in an otherwise parched landscape. Cottonwoods, their leaves a pale green, clung to the banks, their roots deep in the promise of water. Beyond them, the prairie stretched out, a vast expanse of dry grass and skeletal sagebrush that rolled toward distant, flat-topped mesas. For the first few hours, they rode in silence. Ash set a steady pace, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain, reading the story told by a bent blade of grass or a displaced pebble. He was not merely traveling through the land. He was in conversation with it. He began to speak, his voice as low and steady as the rhythm of the horse's hooves. He taught Abigail not with lectures, but with quiet observations. He showed her how to spot the faint impression of a shod horse on rocky ground, explaining that the print told you not just the direction of travel, but the animal's speed and its burden. He pointed to the way the sorrel mare's ears swiveled, her nostrils flaring. The horse, he said, would often sense danger long before a human could. She must learn to listen to the horse. Abigail was a focused student. She asked sharp and practical questions. She learned how to feel the rhythm of her horse's breathing, to know when it was laboring. Ash watched her, noting the lack of complaint, the resilience in her posture. She was not made of glass. This schoolteacher, she was forged from the same sturdy iron as her father's anvils. During a brief stop to water the horses, she looked at the endless dust that coated everything. She remarked that a teacher survives on chalk, a substance not so different from this. Ash allowed himself a small, rare smile. He replied that he survived on the dust itself. It was an honest living. The first sign of trouble came in the late afternoon. Ash reined in his horse, his body going perfectly still. He dismounted and knelt, his fingers hovering over a set of tracks that crossed their path. They were fresh. 3 riders, moving fast. One horse favored its left foreleg. He had seen that same slight limp in the horse belonging to Ransom's man back in the saloon. They were being hunted. The pace changed. The time for lessons was over. Ash pushed them harder, moving away from the relative safety of the river and into the broken, rocky country that offered more cover but also more danger. The sun beat down, and the landscape became a maze of narrow canyons and sharp inclines. The world shrank to the path ahead, the straining of the horses, and the constant, watchful presence of Ash. Abigail's fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she pushed it down. She focused on Ash's instructions, on keeping her horse steady, on matching his relentless pace. She understood now that survival was not a matter of courage alone, but of skill and endurance. Trust was being built with every command he gave and every obstacle she overcame. The hoofprints of their pursuers were a constant, menacing presence. Ransom was good. Ash knew. He was closing the distance. Ash led them through a shallow, fast-moving creek, hoping the water would hide their trail, but he knew it would only buy them a few minutes. As dusk began to settle, painting the canyon walls in shades of purple and blood orange, Ash saw they were being driven into a box canyon. The walls were too steep to climb. They were trapped. Then, just as despair began to set in, he saw it, far to the south, on the highest point of the painted bluffs. A flicker of light. It grew steadily, a plume of smoke rising into the twilight sky. A signal fire. Henry Carter had understood. Ash turned to Abigail. He told her to hold on. He spurred his horse, not toward the back of the canyon, but into a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the northern wall. It was a dangerous path, barely wide enough for a single horse, but it was their only way out. They scrambled through, rocks skittering under their hooves, and emerged onto a high ridge. Below them, they could see Ransom and his men ride into the mouth of the box canyon, their figures small and dark. They would follow the tracks to the dead end, confused. The decoy fire to the south would draw their attention, making them think their prey had somehow circled around them. It was the breathing room they needed. They rode for another hour in the deepening dark before Ash finally found a place to make camp. It was a hollow scooped out of the base of a rock formation, well hidden and sheltered from the wind. There would be no fire tonight, no warmth to ward off the high desert chill. They ate jerky and hardtack in silence, the only sounds the soft chewing of the horses and the lonely cry of a distant coyote. Abigail wrapped her blanket tighter around her shoulders. The adrenaline of the chase had faded, leaving behind an aching exhaustion and the raw edge of fear. She looked at Ash, his profile etched by the faint starlight. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke a language of fierce competence and unwavering honor. She finally broke the silence, her voice soft. She asked if he had ever wondered about the name they called her in town. Ash did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the darkness that surrounded them. He said he did not listen to town gossip. A small, wry smile touched Abigail's lips. "They call me the Virgin of Willow Creek." She said it sounded absurd out here, under the vast, indifferent sky. She said they called her that to make things simple, to put her in a box they could understand. A woman who reads books and does not seek a husband must be strange, cold. So they gave her a name. It is what people do. They call things names so they do not have to look at what they truly are. They call it for their own convenience. She finished. "Not because they know anything about my heart." Ash turned his head then, and his dark eyes met hers. He saw past the label, past the resolute schoolteacher and the surprisingly capable woman with a shotgun. He saw a person fighting not just for justice, but for the right to define herself. He understood that fight. His own people had been given many names by men who did not care to know their hearts. He gave a slow nod of understanding. It was a small gesture, but in the cold, silent dark of the wilderness, it was enough. It was the beginning of a trust that went deeper than a simple contract. They were no longer just a guide in his charge. They were two people bound by a shared purpose, with a long and dangerous road still ahead. They settled down to rest, not as strangers, but as allies against the coming night. To lose Cole Ransom and his men, Ash turned north, away from the established trails that followed the wide, muddy river. He led Abigail into a land that seemed to breathe a different air. The red rock grew bolder, sculpted by wind into monuments and cathedrals that dwarfed the riders. The sagebrush smelled sharper, more pungent. This was Deneta, the homeland of his people, the Dine. It was a place defined not by fences or deeds, but by sacred mountains, by stories carried on the wind, by the very bones of his ancestors resting in the soil. Ash's posture changed as they crossed the unseen boundary. The tension in his shoulders eased, replaced by a deep, quiet reverence. He was no longer just a guide. He was a man returning home, carrying a world of trouble with him. He worried this trouble would stain the harmony of the place. He felt the weight of the white man's law in his saddlebag, a collection of papers and numbers that felt alien here. He was bringing a foreign conflict into a land that had already suffered enough from outsiders. After another day of hard riding, they saw them, a cluster of hogans. The traditional dwellings of the Dean sat nestled in a shallow valley protected by a sweeping mesa. The 8-sided structures of log and earth seemed to grow from the ground itself, their doorways facing east to greet the morning sun. A flock of sheep, guarded by a pair of lean dogs, grazed on the sparse vegetation. Smoke curled from the center of one of the roofs, a thin, gray ribbon against the immense blue sky. An old man with a face like a dried riverbed emerged from the largest hogan. His long, gray hair was tied back with a simple leather thong. He wore a calm authority as naturally as he wore his woven blanket. This was Chibigay, an elder whose wisdom was a well from which his community drew its strength. He watched their approach without surprise, as if he had been expecting them. Ash dismounted and spoke to him in the fluid, tonal language of the Dine. He spoke of the trouble in Willow Creek, of the railroad man named Maddox, and of the woman he was guiding. He did not show the elder the ledger. Not yet. First, he offered respect. Chibigay listened patiently, his dark eyes moving from Ash to Abigail. He assessed her not with suspicion, but with a deep, searching gaze. He saw the fatigue in her posture, but also the unbending strength. When Ash finished, the elder nodded slowly and gestured toward his hogan. He spoke in English, his voice raspy but clear. He said the woman is welcome. Any person who stands against the shadow of the iron snake is a friend. Inside, the hogan was a single, round room, surprisingly spacious and cool. A fire smoldered in a shallow pit in the center. Woven blankets of intricate design covered the floor and walls. A young woman sat before a large, upright loom, her fingers moving with a blur of practiced motion, weaving a story of red, black, and white wool. She looked up as they entered, and her eyes, bright and intelligent, found Ash. A smile of genuine warmth lit her face. She was Leia Benali, a friend from Ash's youth, before he had gone to scout for the soldiers. She rose and greeted him, her voice a soft melody. Abigail watched them, noting the easy familiarity, the shared history that flowed between them in a few quiet words. She felt a pang of something she could not name, a sense of her own otherness, of being a stranger in a world she did not understand. She was the teacher, the one who was supposed to have the answers. But here, she was the ignorant child. They shared a simple meal of mutton stew and flatbread. Chibigay finally asked to see the book. Abigail retrieved the ledger from her satchel and handed it to him. The old man turned the pages with a careful, almost ceremonial gravity. He could not read the English words, but he understood the lists of names and the maps of stolen land. He pointed to the clumsy forgeries of the headmen's signatures. He explained that this book confirmed what they had long suspected. Maddox was not trading for land. He was stealing it. The railroad was his weapon, He would lay his tracks to cut off a clan from its water source or its winter grazing grounds. Then his lawyers would arrive, offering a pittance for the now useless land. He called it progress, but it was conquest by another name. The ledger was the truth. Chi said it was the key to showing the white man's world the ugliness behind the railroad's promises. He looked at Ash, his expression serious. He said Ash walked a difficult path, with one foot in the world of his ancestors and one in the world of the white man. He told him he must keep his balance, to fight for his people using the enemy's weapons, their laws and their papers, was not a betrayal. It was a new way to be a warrior. Later, as the sun began to set, Abigail walked with Leah among the sheep. Leah spoke of her weaving, explaining how each pattern had a meaning, how the threads told the story of her people, of the creation, of the long walk, of their resilience. She pointed to the turquoise bracelet on Abigail's wrist and smiled. She said it was the color of the sky, a piece of heaven to protect the wearer. The loom represented patience. She said, "A story, like a blanket, is not made in a day. It requires a steady hand and a believing heart." As they walked back toward the Hogans, a rider appeared on the ridge, a stark silhouette against the fiery sunset. He was not one of Chi's people. He rode tall and lean, his hair long and unbound. He carried a rifle across his lap with an easy familiarity. Ash's hand went to his pistol. The rider raised a hand in a sign of peace and rode slowly down into the valley. He was Apache, a scout by the name of Nantan. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. The peace of the small community was disturbed by an old, deep-seated tension. The Navajo and the Apache had a long history of conflict, of raids and rivalries that stretched back generations. While they now shared a common enemy in the encroaching white settlers, the old mistrust remained. Nantan dismounted, his eyes hard and watchful. He spoke to Ash, not in English, but in the clipped, direct tongue of the Apache. He said he had been tracking a group of white men led by a snake named Ransom. He had seen their signal fire and had seen them ride into a trap. He warned Ash that Ransom was not a man who gave up easily. He was circling back, like a patient coyote. Nantan was passing through on his own business, but he felt it was right to give warning. An enemy of Ransom was a temporary friend. The tension between the two men was a palpable thing, a quiet struggle of pride and history. Nantan did not stay long. He accepted a drink of water, gave a curt nod, and rode off into the deepening twilight. His visit left a chill in the air. Ransom was still out there. The sanctuary of Danetta was not as secure as it had seemed. The next day, the wind began to blow. It started as a whisper, then grew to a steady moan, picking up sand and dust until the air itself was a roiling, brown cloud. A sandstorm. They took shelter inside Chi's hogan, the wind howling outside like a hungry beast. Ash used the enforced stillness to teach Abigail a simple, practical skill. He showed her how to tie a throat latch knot, one that would hold fast in a gale but could be released with a single pull. He explained that in a storm, a panicked horse could be a death sentence. Her hands, so used to the delicate work of holding a pen, were clumsy at first with the thick leather, but she persisted, her brow furrowed in concentration, until she could tie the knot with her eyes closed. It was a small thing, but it was another piece of the language of this land, another step away from the helpless woman some thought her to be. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of rain and wet sage. As they emerged from the hogan, they saw it, a single raven, its feathers the color of polished obsidian, sat on a rock outcropping, watching them with an unsettling intelligence. It croaked once, a sound like a stone striking stone, then launched itself into the sky. Leah looked at Ash, her expression troubled. A raven could be a powerful omen. It was a messenger, but whether it brought good or ill was never certain. The unease lingered. Later that day, Chi sent a young boy, barely a man, to check on the sheep in a farther pasture. The boy returned hours later, his face pale with fear. He spoke rapidly to Chi and Dine. There were tracks, he said, not the Apaches, not Ransom's men, a single rider, on a shod horse, had been watching the valley from a high ridge. The tracks led back east, toward the railroad line. Ash went to see for himself. He read the story in the dirt with an expert eye. The rider had been there for hours, patient, observant, and he had been careless, dropping a single machine-made cigarette. It was not the work of a native scout. When he returned, Chi Begay had the young boy before him. Under the elder's steady, disappointed gaze, the boy confessed. A white man from the railroad survey crew had given him a silver dollar a week ago. He had told the boy to simply ride to the telegraph office in the next settlement if he ever saw Ashnez return, especially if he had a white woman with him. The boy, shamed and terrified, had done as he was told that morning. The lure of the silver coin had been stronger than the teachings of his elders. The betrayal was a quiet, devastating blow. Maddox's reach was longer and more insidious than they had imagined. He did not need an army of gunmen when he could buy a man's loyalty for a piece of silver. Deneta was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. That evening, the mood was somber. Chi Begay told them they had to leave at once, before Ransom could act on the information. He gave them fresh supplies and a new route, a difficult, little-known trail through the high mesas. He placed a hand on Ash's shoulder. He said to remember his balance. The boy's betrayal was a sickness born of the white man's greed, but it did not represent the heart of the Dine. As they prepared the horses in the dark, Abigail went to Chi Begay. She told him that in her world, water was something that came from a pump. It was a convenience. Here, she had learned it was a blessing, a gift to be honored. She thanked him for teaching her this. The old man looked at her and saw that her humility was genuine. He told her that a heart that is open to learning is a strong heart. He said she had the spirit of a warrior, just as Ash did. They rode out under a sky littered with stars, leaving the quiet valley behind. The brief sense of peace had been shattered. They were fugitives once more. But something had changed. The bond between them had been tempered in the quiet wisdom of the Hogan, tested by the wind, and solidified by a shared betrayal. Abigail now understood the true nature of the fight. It was not just about a ledger. It was about a way of life, and Ash knew he was no longer just a hired guide. He was a Dine warrior, fighting for the future of his people, with an unlikely schoolteacher from Willow Creek as his staunchest ally. The trail Chi Begay had sent them on was a hard whisper of a path, a secret told only between the rocks and the sky. It led them out of the high mesas and back toward the unforgiving flatlands where the railroad had scarred its way across the territory. They rode with a new urgency, the knowledge of the informer a spur at their backs. They were joined on the second day by a welcome sight. Henry Carter, who had tracked them with a skill that rivaled Ash's own. His diversion had worked, but he knew Ransom would not be fooled for long. His presence added another steady hand, another rifle, and a quiet loyalty that needed no words. Their destination was a place on the map called Red Mesa, a lonely water stop for the insatiable thirst of the steam locomotives. It was a necessary evil, a place where their path would have to cross the iron snakes. Ash's plan was born of desperation and an intimate knowledge of his enemy's tools. The train would have to stop, and when it took on water, the engine would release a great cloud of steam. In the confusion of that white, hissing fog, under the cover of the machine's own breath, they would slip across the tracks and be gone. They arrived at night, dismounting a safe distance away and approaching on foot through a landscape of stunted junipers. The air was cold and still. The rail line was a pair of silver threads stretching into infinity under a canopy of brilliant stars. The water tower stood like a lone, skeletal sentinel beside the tracks, its long pipe hanging down like a thirsty throat. A small pump house and a stack of oil barrels for the machinery sat nearby. Then they saw the train, a dark shape far down the track, its single headlamp a baleful yellow eye. It was not a passenger train. It was a short, ugly work train, a locomotive and a few flatbeds, likely carrying guards and supplies. As it chuffed closer, its rhythmic breathing filling the silence, they could see the silhouettes of men with rifles on the cars. Maddox was taking no chances. Ash, Abigail, and Henry took cover behind a rocky outcropping, their hearts beating in time with the approaching engine. The train hissed and groaned to a stop, the screech of its brakes a violation of the night's peace. The guards jumped down, stretching and talking in low voices, their forms illuminated by the lanterns they carried. This was the moment. Ash looked at Abigail, ready to give the signal to move. A voice cut through the night, casual and laced with predatory amusement. It came not from the train, but from the deep shadows near the pump house. A lantern flared to life, held aloft. In its golden circle stood Cole Ransom. He was not alone. 2 of his men stood with him, and between them, held tightly, his hands bound and a fresh bruise swelling on his cheek, was Henry Carter. The world seemed to lurch to a stop. Ash stared, his mind racing, trying to understand. Henry had been with them only moments ago. They had been ambushed with a silence and speed that was almost supernatural. Ransom must have been waiting for them, hidden for hours, perhaps days. The betrayed information had led him straight here. He had not just followed them. He had arrived before them. Ransom smiled, a chilling expression in the lantern light. He had traded Henry a hard blow for his gun, and the fight had been silent and swift. He gestured with his pistol toward Henry. Ransom said the terms were simple: the ledger and the schoolteacher. In exchange for their friend, he gave them until the train was finished taking on water. Maybe 5 minutes. A cold dread washed over Ash. The weight of his promise to protect Abigail felt like a physical stone in his gut. He had led them into this. His plan had been anticipated. His strategy turned against him. He saw the flicker of fear in Abigail's eyes, but it was quickly banked by a familiar, stubborn fire. He saw the defiant anger in Henry's face. They were a team, and their enemy had just taken one of them hostage. Ash raised his hands slowly, a gesture of capitulation. He stepped out from behind the rocks. He said all right, he would do it. He just needed to get the book. He spoke to Ransom, keeping the man's attention focused, drawing his eyes away from Abigail. He was buying seconds, his mind working furiously, looking for an edge, a flaw in Ransom's perfect trap. He saw it. The spare horses were tethered just behind Ransom's position, near the stack of oil barrels, and the wind, a faint but steady breeze, was blowing from that direction, straight toward the train. He exchanged a look with Abigail, a flicker of communication so brief that no one else would have seen it. It was a look of shared desperation, of a trust that went beyond words. She gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Ash took a slow step forward, as if to comply. Then he dropped. He hit the dirt and fired his pistol, not at Ransom, but at the lantern he held. The glass shattered, plunging their side of the tracks into darkness. In the same motion, he yelled a sharp command to the horses. Ransom cursed, firing blindly into the space where Ash had been. But Ash was already moving, a shadow among shadows. He sprinted toward the tethered horses, pulling his knife. The railroad guards, startled by the gunshot, began shouting, raising their own rifles. A second shot rang out, this one from Abigail. She had not aimed at a man, but at the ground near the horses' feet. The bullet kicking up dirt and the sound of the blast sent the already nervous animals into a frenzy. Ash sliced through their ropes. The terrified horses bolted, stampeding directly through Ransom's position and toward the train. Men shouted and scrambled out of the way of the thundering hooves. In the chaos, Ash reached the oil barrels. He kicked one over, the thick, dark liquid glugging onto the dusty ground. He fired his pistol again, the muzzle flash a brilliant orange flower in the night. The spark ignited the spilled oil. It did not explode, it erupted. A great whoosh of fire shot upwards, and with it, a roiling cloud of greasy, black smoke. The wind caught the smoke immediately, carrying it in a thick, choking curtain across the tracks, enveloping the train and the guards. It was no longer a steam cloud. It was a wall of pure, oily blackness. Through the swirling smoke and confusion, Abigail saw one of Ransom's men take aim at Henry, who was struggling against his bonds. She did not hesitate. She raised the sawed-off shotgun, the weapon that had become an extension of her will. The blast was a physical blow, a roar that cut through the cacophony. The gunman screamed and fell back, his arm mangled. Ash materialized out of the smoke, his knife flashing as he cut Henry's ropes. Free! Henry scooped up the fallen gunman's pistol. The three of them were together again, armed and fighting. They retreated, using the thick, disorienting smoke as their shield. The railroad guards were firing now, but their shots were wild, aimed at phantoms in the blinding, stinging cloud. They could hear Ransom shouting orders, his voice raw with fury. As they scrambled up a rocky embankment, a bullet whined past Ash's head, striking the rock beside Abigail. The bullet itself did not touch her, but it sent a spray of rock fragments and a long, sharp splinter of wood from a nearby railroad tie flying through the air. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and stumbled. Ash caught her, his arms circling her waist. He did not know she was hurt. Not yet. He only knew they had to get away. They reached their own horses, hidden in the junipers, and mounted. They rode hard into the night, the sounds of shouting and gunfire fading behind them. Back at the water tower, in the thinning, foul-smelling smoke, Cole Ransom kicked at the dirt in frustration. His perfect trap had been broken. His prey had escaped. But as the last of the smoke cleared, the light from the remaining lanterns caught something on the ground, half buried in the dust where Abigail had been hidden. It was a small, silver-framed daguerreotype that must have fallen from her satchel. He picked it up. It was a formal portrait of her, the schoolteacher, her expression serious, her eyes looking directly at the camera. A slow, cruel smile spread across Ransom's face. He had lost the battle, but he had just found a new weapon. Now the whole territory would know the face of the woman with the ledger. They rode for 2 hours, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and Red Mesa. They finally stopped in a deep wash, the high walls offering them cover. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by bone-deep weariness and the sharp tang of gunpowder in the air. Abigail swayed in her saddle. She said Ash's name. Her voice strained. She told him she thought she was hurt. Henry immediately took the reins of their horses, leading them farther down the wash to stand guard, giving them space. Ash was at Abigail's side in an instant, helping her down. It was only then, in the pale moonlight, that he saw the dark stain spreading across the shoulder of her shirt. He led her to the base of the wash wall, sitting her down gently, his heart hammered against his ribs. He had promised to protect her, and he had failed. She was hurt because of him. He carefully examined the wound. It was not a bullet, but a thick, jagged piece of wood, buried deep in the muscle of her shoulder. Blood oozed from the torn flesh. It had to come out, and the wound had to be cleaned. He built a small, smokeless fire, using the skills the army had taught him, shielding its light with his body and a blanket. He took a flask of whiskey from his saddlebag and his knife. He sterilized the blade in the flame, the metal glowing a dull red. He turned back to her. She watched him, her face pale but her expression steady. He knelt before her, his hands hovering over the torn, blood-soaked fabric of her shirt. His hands, which had been so steady while firing a pistol or tying a knot, now carried a fine tremor. He was afraid, not of the blood, but of causing her more pain, of a closeness born from violence. He stopped. He could not bring himself to touch her without her permission. He looked into her moss-green eyes. He asked, his voice rougher than he intended, if he may. She held his gaze, and in that moment, there was no guide and no schoolteacher. There were only two people, bound together in the vast, dangerous dark. She gave a small, deliberate nod, with a tenderness that belied the grim task. He carefully cut the cloth away from the wound. His fingers brushed her skin, and it felt as if a bolt of lightning had passed between them. He worked quickly, his touch surprisingly gentle. She winced when he pulled the splinter free, a sharp hiss of pain escaping her lips. But she did not cry out. As he poured a little of the whiskey onto a clean cloth to wash the wound, she looked at him, a faint, wry smile touching her lips despite the pain. She told him that if she were to faint, he should please try to catch her by her good arm. The small jest, an act of incredible grit in the face of her injury, broke the spell of his fear. He looked at her, at this woman of impossible courage and quiet wit, and felt a wave of admiration so profound it almost stole his breath. He had been hired to protect her, but he was beginning to realize she was just as capable of protecting him. He finished cleaning the wound and bandaged it tightly, his hands finally steady again. The night was far from over, and Santa Fe was still a long way off. They climbed into the high country, leaving the red desert floor for the cooler, pine-scented air of the Chusca Mountains. The land rose around them, a fortress of stone and timber that offered a temporary illusion of safety. Henry Carter scouted ahead and behind, a silent wraith who seemed to melt into the landscape, his presence a constant, reassuring pressure at the edges of their awareness. They made camp in a hollow of rock that smelled of pine needles and damp earth. Abigail's shoulder was a throbbing ache, but the wound was clean, and she moved with a determined stiffness that refused to acknowledge the pain. While Henry took the first watch from a high vantage point, Ash built a fire. It was a risk, but the cold was a physical thing, a predator that gnawed at their bones. The temperature dropped with the sun, and the wind that swept down from the high peaks carried the sharp, clean promise of an early snow. Ash built the fire with care, a small, contained blaze that offered more warmth than light. It was a hearth, a circle of safety in an immense and hostile world. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows on the granite walls and on Abigail's face. The firelight softened the tired lines around her eyes and found the gold in her dark honey hair. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, sharing a meal of roasted rabbit Henry had caught. The silence between them was no longer the empty space of strangers, but a comfortable quiet, filled with the unspoken experiences of the last few days. They had seen each other's fear and each other's strength. There were few secrets left between them. Abigail was the first to speak, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the flames. She spoke of her childhood, of the constant, comforting clang of her father's hammer from the forge. He had been a man of quiet principles, she said, a man whose word was as solid as the iron he shaped. He had taught her to read not just from books, but from the world around her, to see the truth of a thing, whether it was the grain in a piece of wood or the character of a man. Then, her gaze steady on the fire, she spoke of the name they had given her. She did not say it with shame or anger, but with a kind of weary clarity, as if discussing a character in a book. She said she knew what they thought of her in Willow Creek, that she was cold, or afraid, or too proud, but they were wrong. It had never been about fear. It had been about choice. She wanted the right to make her own decisions, about her life, her body, her heart, in a world where women were often treated as property to be claimed. Her refusal was her only true possession. It was her declaration of independence. She looked up from the fire and met Ash's gaze. Her own was clear and unwavering. She was not waiting for a wealthy man, or a powerful one. She was waiting for a man who knew the value of a promise, a man who kept his word. The words hung in the air between them, a gift of trust so profound it made the air feel thin. She was not just explaining her past, she was telling him that she saw him, truly saw him for the man he was. Her vulnerability unlocked something deep within Ash, a place of pain he had kept walled off for years. The firelight flickered in his dark eyes, and, for the first time, he spoke not as a guide or a former scout, but as a Dane man who carried the sorrows of his people. He told her of the long walk. He did not use the white man's name for the prison camp, Bosque Redondo. He spoke of it as Huildi, the place of suffering. He described a land of bitter water and alkali soil where his people had been driven like cattle, forced to live in holes scraped from the earth. He spoke of the sickness, the hunger, the crushing weight of despair. His voice grew softer, the words pulling from a place of deep memory. He spoke of a girl, his younger sister. She had not been taken by a soldier's bullet, but by a cough that settled deep in her chest, a sickness born of bad water and a broken heart. He remembered holding her hand, feeling it grow colder, her last breath a tiny, weightless thing in the vast silence of Huildi. Her loss was not a single event but a constant presence, a symbol of everything that had been taken from them, their land, their livelihood, their dignity. The ledger Abigail carried was not just a list of crimes. It was the story of his sister, written again and again in a different hand. When he finished, a profound silence settled over the camp. The only sounds were the sighing of the wind in the pines and the soft pop of a log in the fire. The space between them was now filled with a shared understanding of loss and a shared desire for justice. They were from different worlds, a schoolteacher and a Navajo warrior, but their hearts spoke the same language of honor and grief. Slowly, Ash moved around the fire. He knelt before her, not in supplication, but in a gesture of profound equality. The warmth of the fire was on his back, its light on her face. He saw the shimmer of unshed tears in her eyes, not of pity, but of empathy. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed her cheek. It was a question. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a silent answer that closed the last gap between them. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of sudden passion, but of slow, deliberate recognition. It was as gentle as the firelight, as solid as the mountain around them. It was a promise, a confirmation of everything that had passed between them without words. It tasted of wood smoke and the cold night air, of sorrow, and of a hope so fierce it was almost painful. In that kiss, they were no longer a guide in his charge, no longer a Navajo and a white woman. They were just two people, finding a sanctuary in each other. When the kiss ended, they remained there for a long moment, their foreheads resting together, breathing the same cold air. He pulled back slightly, his hand moving to her wrist, his thumb stroking the smooth, cool surface of her turquoise bracelet. He looked into her eyes, and the firelight reflected in their depths. His voice was a low, steady vow, spoken to her and to the ancient, listening land. The Navajo warrior was hired to guard the Virgin. He took the job for the rest of his life. The words were a brand, a sacred oath that settled into the very marrow of their bones. The mockery of the town had been transformed into a term of endearment, a part of the foundation of their new world. The contract was fulfilled, and a covenant had been made. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow more strongly now. A coyote called from a distant ridge, a lonely, wild sound that echoed the untamed freedom in their hearts. The storm was coming, but for the first time, they were not afraid. They would face it together. The next morning dawned cold and gray, the sky the color of lead. The new resolve between them was a quiet, powerful force. They moved with a synchronized purpose, preparing to leave. The journey was no longer just about survival. It was about a shared future. Henry Carter returned from his final scout of their back trail, his face grim. He had not seen any sign of ransom, but that was not what worried him. He had ridden to a small, remote trading post a few miles away, a place with a telegraph line that was not under the thumb of Willow Creek. He had a friend there, an operator who owed him a favor. Henry had sent Sheriff Hale's coded message to Judge Miller in Santa Fe. The reply had come back an hour ago. Henry handed the decoded message to Abigail. Her face paled as she read the terse, devastating words. Judge Miller was compromised. Maddox had gotten to him. Santa Fe was no longer a safe harbor. It was the heart of the enemy's territory. The law they had been riding toward was a lie. For a moment, the weight of the news threatened to crush them. They were out of options, fugitives with a useless destination. But then Abigail looked at Ash, and she saw the same unyielding fire in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. The vow of the night before had not been for an easy life, but for a shared one. Their purpose had not been broken, it had been clarified. Sheriff Hale had included one last piece of information in his message. There was another judge, a man named Doyle in Silverton, a mining town high in the mountains of Colorado, a town known for its fierce independence and its distrust of powerful outsiders like Cyrus Maddox. It was a long shot, a dangerous ride into even wilder country, but it was their only shot. Their mission had changed. They were no longer just messengers, trying to deliver a piece of evidence. They were now the instruments of justice itself. They would not just hand over the ledger. They would see this through to the end. They would confront Maddox not just on paper, but face to face. Ash looked at Abigail, then at Henry. He saw the same resolve in both their faces. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. He turned his horse, not south toward Santa Fe, but north toward the distant, snow-dusted peaks of the San Juan Mountains, toward Silverton, toward the coming storm. Silverton was not a town that whispered. It shouted, carved into a high mountain valley in the Colorado Territory. Its voice was the rhythmic, percussive roar of stamp mills crushing ore, a sound that echoed off the granite peaks day and night. It was the sound of a place tearing its wealth from the earth with brute force. After the vast, speaking silences of Deneta, the noise was a physical assault. The air, thin and sharp with the coming winter, tasted of coal smoke and blasting powder. They rode into the muddy main street, a trio of weary travelers attracting little notice among the scores of hard-faced miners and merchants who hurried through the cold. They found lodging in a boarding house run by a woman whose face looked as tired as the surrounding mountains. It was there, as they planned their next move, that a knock came at their door. The woman who stood in the hallway was stout and capable, her graying hair pinned back with a fierce neatness. She carried a basket that smelled of herbs and clean linen. She introduced herself as Martha Whitcomb, a midwife and the closest thing the town had to a nurse. Henry had sent for her, using a discreet message passed through a stable boy. Martha's eyes, a shrewd and intelligent blue, took in the scene at a glance. She saw the exhaustion etched on their faces and the barely concealed tension in their postures. Her gaze lingered on Abigail, noting the stiffness of her shoulder and the pale cast of her skin. She wasted no time on pleasantries. She examined Abigail's bandaged wound with practiced hands, her touch firm but gentle. She declared that the stitching was rough but effective, a good trailside job. But it needed to be cleaned and properly dressed by a man with more than a campfire for light and whiskey for medicine. She knew a Dr. Allen, a man who asked few questions and valued his privacy as much as his patients did. An hour later, in a small, clean office that smelled of carbolic acid, Dr. Allen worked with quiet competence, stitching the wound with fine silk thread. He was a man of science and discretion. When he was finished, he gave Abigail a small bottle of laudanum for the pain and a look that said he did not want to know any more of her story. Martha Whitcomb paid him from her own purse, a silent act of solidarity that spoke volumes. That evening, a new arrival joined them, slipping into town as quietly as a shadow. It was Leah Benali. Chi Begay, with his long sight, had known they would need more than just rifles and resolve. He had sent Leah to follow, to bring her knowledge of her people and their history. She was their expert, the one who could read the lies hidden in the white man's documents. Their small band was now complete, a team forged in the wilderness, each member bringing a unique and vital skill to the fight. Ash, the strategist and warrior. Abigail, the voice of conscience and law. Henry, the scout and steadfast rock. And Leah, the keeper of memory and truth. Their first objective was to deliver the ledger into the hands of Judge Doyle. The meeting was arranged by Martha, a woman who seemed to know every secret path and hidden door in Silverton. They met him not in his chambers, but in the back room of a quiet assay office, the air thick with the metallic scent of precious metals. Judge Doyle was a man who seemed to have been carved from the same granite as the mountains. His face was stern, his eyes piercing, and he listened to their story without a flicker of emotion. He took the ledger, his large, calloused hands turning the pages, his expression grim. He said this was a powerful accusation. But Cyrus Maddox was a powerful man. He had an army of lawyers who could turn black ink into gray mist. The ledger was a start, but they would need more. They would need something undeniable, a piece of evidence so clear it could not be refuted. Ash already had a plan. He had learned from the ledger that Maddox kept a branch of his shipping and finance company in Silverton, a small bank that handled the payroll for his mining interests. It was a reasonable assumption that a man as meticulous and corrupt as Maddox would keep a second set of records there, documents too sensitive to be stored at his main offices. The next 2 days were a blur of quiet, intense activity, while Ash, Henry, and Leia planned their infiltration of the bank. Abigail began her own assault. She had learned from Martha that the town council, comprised of the most influential mine owners and merchants, was meeting to discuss a large donation offered by Cyrus Maddox, a donation to build a new, larger schoolhouse. Abigail attended the meeting. She did not arrive as a fugitive or a victim, but as Miss Turner, the schoolteacher from Willow Creek. She stood before the council, a dozen stern-faced men who measured the world in ounces of gold and tons of ore. Her voice was calm, her logic impeccable. She spoke of the importance of education, of teaching children the difference between right and wrong. Then, her moss-green eyes sweeping across their faces, she posed a question that was as sharp and clean as a shard of glass. She asked them if the books their children would learn to read from, the slates they would learn to write on, should be purchased with money earned through theft and deceit. Would they build a foundation of knowledge for their children upon a foundation of lies? The question hung in the stale, cigar-scented air of the council chamber. It was a moral challenge they could not easily dismiss. She had not accused Maddox directly, but she had planted a seed of doubt, a question of honor, in the heart of the town's leadership. She had turned Maddox's own weapon, his money, against him. That night, while the town councilmen argued behind closed doors, Ash, Henry, and Leia made their move. Dressed as laborers, their faces smudged with coal dust, they slipped into the alley behind the bank. Henry, who had worked on more construction sites than he could count, disabled the simple alarm on the back window with a piece of wire and a steady hand. Inside, the bank was a tomb of silent commerce. Moonlight streamed through the tall front windows, illuminating the teller's cage and the massive, imposing door of the main vault. Leia, her senses as sharp as any scout's, noticed something out of place. A section of the polished wood floor behind the manager's desk showed a faint, rectangular outline, a sign of a hidden trapdoor. It took their combined strength to lift it, revealing a small, steep staircase leading down into a dark, musty cellar. At the far end of the cellar, hidden behind a stack of old records, was a second, smaller safe. It was old, but well made. Ash studied the lock. It was beyond his skill to pick, but he had not come to be subtle. He and Henry retrieved a long iron pry bar from a nearby storage closet. The work was slow, brutal, and agonizingly loud. Every groan of the protesting metal sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. Finally, with a loud crack, the safe door gave way. Inside was a single, large tin box. Leia opened it with trembling fingers. It was filled with contracts, deeds, and survey maps. She began to sift through them, her eyes scanning the documents with a speed born of deep knowledge. She found what they were looking for: a series of contracts, signed over the last 5 years, ceding water and grazing rights of entire Navajo clans to Maddox's railroad. And at the bottom of each contract was a signature, or rather, a symbol, the mark of the clan's headman. Leia held one up to the moonlight filtering down from the trapdoor. She traced the symbol with her finger. It was the mark of the Bitterwater clan, but it was wrong. The lines were too perfect, too precise. The true mark was always made with a small, intentional flaw, a spirit line to allow the artist's creativity to escape. This was a forgery, a dead copy. It was the undeniable proof Judge Doyle had asked for. Henry Carter let out a low whistle as he looked at the box of fraudulent documents. "Dirty money is slippery," he murmured. "A man has to hold it tight, or it will slip right through his fingers." As Leia carefully placed the contracts into a satchel, a sound from the alley above made them all freeze. A boot scraping on gravel. Then a low, familiar voice. It was Cole Ransom. He had found them. They scrambled up the stairs. Ash motioned for Henry and Leia to go out the back window and create a diversion. He would lead Ransom away from them, and from the evidence. Ash slipped out the front door of the bank and into the shadows of the main street. He moved quickly, silently, toward a narrow, dark passage between two buildings known as Prospector's Alley. Ransom was on him in an instant, a predator sensing his prey. He appeared at the mouth of the alley, his revolver already in his hand. Gunshots exploded in the confined space, the sound deafening, the muzzle flashes blinding. Bullets tore splinters from the wooden walls. Ash was not trying to win a gunfight. He was trying to control it. He used the deep shadows and the stacks of discarded crates as cover, drawing Ransom deeper into the alley. He was counting Ransom's shots, waiting for the inevitable click of an empty hammer. It came. Ransom fired his sixth shot, and Ash moved. He lunged from behind a stack of barrels, not with his gun, but with his body. He slammed into Ransom, driving him hard against the rough plank wall. Ransom's pistol clattered to the ground. The two men were a tangle of limbs in the darkness, a desperate, grunting struggle of brute force. Ransom was wiry and strong, but Ash was fueled by a cold, righteous fury. He got the upper hand, his forearm pressing against Ransom's throat, pinning him to the wall. Ash drew his own pistol and pressed its cold barrel against Ransom's temple. He had him. He could end it, right there. An eye for an eye, for his sister, for the families in the ledger, for the forged signature on the stolen land. The ghosts of his past screamed for him to pull the trigger. But then he saw Abigail's face in his mind. He heard Chibege's words about balance. He felt the weight of the law, the real law, the one they were trying to serve. Vengeance was a hot, satisfying fire, but it burned out, leaving only ashes. Justice was a foundation, something you could build on. His hand was steady, his finger was on the trigger, but he did not pull it. He brought the butt of his pistol down in a short, sharp arc, striking Ransom just behind the ear. The gunman went limp, his body slumping to the ground, unconscious. Henry appeared at the end of the alley, his own gun drawn, Leia just behind him. He looked at the unconscious form of Cole Ransom, then at Ash. He saw the internal battle that had been won. Ash holstered his pistol. "Ransom is more valuable alive," he said, his voice level, betraying none of the storm that had just raged within him. "He will testify." They had all the pieces now. The ledger, the forged contracts, and the man who had been Maddox's primary weapon. The mask was about to fall, and all of Silverton would be there to see it. The Silverton courthouse was built of rough-hewn pine, and on that day, it seemed the entire town had crammed itself inside, seeking warmth from the storm and a spectacle to break the monotony of the long winter. A wet, heavy snow fell outside the tall windows, muffling the ceaseless roar of the stamp mills and cloaking the town in a blanket of white. It was as if the world outside had gone silent to better hear the truth spoken within. The pot-bellied stove in the corner glowed red-hot, but the air was thick with a different kind of heat, the nervous energy of a community holding its breath. Every bench was full. Miners in their work clothes sat shoulder to shoulder with merchants in their Sunday best. The town councilmen, who had been swayed by Abigail's words, occupied the front row, their face grim and unreadable. Martha Whitcomb sat beside Leah Benali, a bastion of quiet strength. In the back, standing against the wall, was Henry Carter, his arms crossed, his gaze missing nothing. Ash and Abigail sat at a simple plaintiff's table. Ash was a study in stillness, a man of the mesas transplanted into a cage of laws and timber. He watched everything, his face a stoic mask that betrayed none of the turmoil within. Abigail sat straight-backed, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a simple, dark dress, the only adornment the sliver of turquoise at her wrist. There was no trace of the weary fugitive in her demeanor, only the unshakable composure of a teacher about to deliver a lesson. Then Cyrus Maddox entered, and a wave of whispers rippled through the room. He was not the monster of their imaginations. He was a man of impeccable tailoring and refined manners, his silver hair neatly combed, his eyes a cold, calculating blue. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world was a ledger and he owned the pen. Beside him was his lawyer, a man named Fletcher, brought in from Denver. Fletcher had a face like a well-honed knife and a voice that dripped with condescending charm. Judge Doyle entered, and the room fell silent. He took his seat, the granite planes of his face betraying no partiality. The trial began. Fletcher opened with a brilliant, vicious assault. He did not deny the events at the Blue Lantern or Red Mesa. He reframed them. He painted a picture of a troubled, hysterical woman, the so-called Virgin of Willow Creek, who had fallen under the sway of a dangerous renegade. He claimed Ash Nez had kidnapped Miss Turner, filling her head with paranoid fantasies about Mr. Maddox, a respected philanthropist and captain of industry. This whole affair, Fletcher concluded with a dismissive wave of his hand, was a simple case of abduction and delusion. Judge Doyle was unmoved. He called his first witness. Sheriff Hale walked slowly to the stand. Under Fletcher's sharp questioning, Hale admitted he had not seen Ash force Abigail from town. He admitted she was a woman of solitary habits, but when asked if he believed she had been abducted, the sheriff looked from Fletcher to Ash, and then to Abigail. He took a deep breath, a man finally choosing his footing. He said he believed Miss Turner was a woman who knew her own mind, and he knew for a fact that Cole Ransom and his men had shot up the Blue Lantern Saloon on Cyrus Maddox's business. The next witness was Josiah Pike's young son. The boy, scrubbed clean and wearing an ill-fitting suit, walked to the stand, his eyes wide. Fletcher tried to object, but the judge allowed it. In a small, clear voice, the boy told the court what had happened. He said the bad man had pointed a gun at him, and he said Miss Turner had shot the man's leg to make him stop. He pointed a finger at Abigail. He said she saved him. A murmur went through the courtroom. A child's simple truth was a difficult thing for even a skilled lawyer to twist. Then Judge Doyle called a name that made a jolt go through the room. Cole Ransom. Ransom was brought in from the town jail, his hands cuffed. He looked pale and drawn, but his arrogance had not entirely deserted him. Fletcher immediately began to discredit him, listing his known crimes, painting him as a liar and a scoundrel whose word was worthless. Judge Doyle intervened. He looked directly at Ransom. He said Ransom was facing a long list of charges that would likely see him spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. However, the court was always interested in cooperation. The judge laid out the choice with cold precision: a lifetime of breaking rocks for another man's greed, or a chance at a sliver of mercy for speaking the truth. Ransom looked at Maddox. He saw no loyalty in the railroad baron's cold eyes, only annoyance at an asset that had become a liability. He looked at Ash and saw not hatred, but a kind of grim understanding. He was a cornered animal, and he chose to save himself. He began to speak, his voice low and raspy. He admitted everything. He said he had been on Cyrus Maddox's payroll for 3 years. He said he was hired to retrieve the ledger and to silence the woman who carried it. He said the ambush at Red Mesa was planned on Maddox's direct orders. When he finished, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Cyrus Maddox sat perfectly still, but a small muscle twitched in his jaw. The final witness against Maddox was Chibigay. He entered the courtroom with Leia at his side, his presence bringing a quiet, ancient dignity that dwarfed everyone else in the room. He carried a leather pouch. Leia stood beside him to translate. Through Leia, Chibigay told the court of the lands and water rights that had been taken. Fletcher objected, calling it irrelevant history. Judge Doyle overruled him. Then, Chibigay took the forged contracts from the tin box and laid them on the judge's bench. Beside them, he placed a series of older documents, treaties and trade agreements his people had made years ago, and from his pouch, he removed a small, carved wooden seal. Leia explained. She showed the court the symbol on the forged contracts, the mark of the headman. Then she showed them the mark made by the authentic seal on the older documents. To an untrained eye, they looked identical, but Leia pointed out the spirit line, the small, intentional break in the pattern. She said that among the dying, a craftsman never creates a perfect, closed design. There must always be a path for the spirit to move, for creativity to flow. The marks on Maddox's contracts were perfect, flawless, and dead. They were forgeries. The case was sealed. The ledger, the testimony, the seals. It was an unbreakable chain of evidence. Fletcher knew he was beaten on the facts, so he resorted to the oldest, ugliest weapon in his arsenal. He turned his attention to Abigail. He could not disprove her story, so he would try to destroy her character. He rose, his voice once again smooth and confident. He approached the witness stand, where Abigail now sat. He spoke of her reputation in Willow Creek. He used the name, spitting it out like an insult. The Virgin of Willow Creek, he asked, his voice dripping with false sympathy. If it was not true that a woman of her particular sensibilities, a woman alone, without the guidance of a husband, might be prone to flights of fancy, to imagining conspiracies where there were none. Ash rose from his chair, his body tense with a rage he had held in check all day. His voice was a low growl. He told the lawyer that was enough. But before Judge Doyle could bang his gavel, Abigail raised a hand, a small, calming gesture. She looked at Ash, her eyes conveying a silent message. I have this. She then turned her gaze to Fletcher, and the full, formidable force of her intellect and her will met his. She was no longer afraid. She answered his question. Her voice did not tremble. It was as clear and solid as the iron rail outside. She said her life, and the choices she has made for it, are her own. They are not a matter for public debate, nor are they a measure of her honesty. My character, Mr. Fletcher, is not defined by the rumors men whisper about me in saloons. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze sweeping from the lawyer to the jury box, to the faces of the miners and their wives. She said a person's honor is not located in their bedchamber. It is not something that can be given or taken by another. A person's dignity is found in their word and in their deeds. It is found in the courage to speak the truth, even when your voice shakes. She sat back. The courtroom was utterly, profoundly silent. The only sound was the hiss of the melting snow dripping from the eaves outside. In that moment, she had done more than defend herself. She had spoken a truth so fundamental that it resonated in the heart of every person in that room. She had taken their insult, their petty label, and reforged it into a shield of honor. Cyrus Maddox stared at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than arrogance showed in his eyes. It was the shock of a man who had underestimated his enemy, a man who had tried to swat a fly and found he had struck a hornet's nest. He had been beaten, not by a gun or by a law, but by the simple, unassailable dignity of a schoolteacher from a dusty town. The jury did not even need to deliberate. The verdict was written on the faces of everyone in the room. The trial was over. The truth like the snow outside, had finally covered everything. That night, as the blizzard raged, cutting Silverton off from the rest of the world, Cyrus Maddox made his move. He had no intention of waiting for a formal sentencing. He bribed a guard and slipped out of the hotel where he was being held. He had a horse waiting, a strong animal capable of breaking a trail through the high, snow-choked passes. He would be in a different territory by morning. But as he rode up the winding trail toward the summit of the pass, two figures emerged from the swirling snow, blocking his path. One was Henry Carter, holding a rifle as steady as the mountain itself. The other was the Apache scout, Nantan, who had appeared as silently as the falling snow. They stood like ghosts, men of the wilderness, guardians of a justice that could not be outrun. The escape was over before it had even begun. The blizzard did not relent. It was a physical wall of white, a roaring, wind-driven siege that had cut Silverton off from the world, transforming the rugged mining town into an isolated island in a sea of snow. Cyrus Maddox, his tailored suit now damp and flecked with ice, was escorted back down the treacherous pass by Henry and Nantan. The railroad baron's arrogance had finally been sandblasted away, leaving behind the raw, desperate fear of a man whose money could no longer buy him an escape. He was placed under heavy guard in the town's small, stone jail, a place built to hold drunken miners and petty thieves, not titans of industry. Cole Ransom was in the adjacent cell, a sullen, brooding presence. The two men, once master and instrument, now shared a common fate, the silence between them thick with betrayal and failure. Judge Doyle, a man who understood the volatile nature of his town, knew he could not hold Maddox for long. As soon as the passes were clear, federal marshals would have to be summoned, but the blizzard was a blessing and a curse. It kept Maddox a prisoner, but it also kept any outside help from arriving. Silverton was on its own. The decision was made to move both prisoners to the sub-level of the bank, its vault a far more secure cage than the town jail. As dusk fell on the second day of the storm, the plan was put into motion. The wind had lessened slightly, but the snow was still falling, thick and heavy, muffling all sound and reducing visibility to a few feet. Ash and Henry, along with Sheriff Hale and two deputized miners, formed the escort. They moved on foot, a tight cluster of dark figures against the swirling white. Maddox and Ransom, both in handcuffs, were in the center. Abigail and Leah watched from the doorway of the boarding house, their anxiety a cold knot. The street was deserted, the town hunkered down against the storm's fury. Their path took them past the edge of the rail yard, a sprawling complex of tracks and sheds now buried under a deep blanket of snow. It was there that the world dissolved into chaos. It began not with a bang, but with a sudden, unnatural thickening of the air. A foul, oily smell cut through the clean scent of the snow. A dense, black fog, darker than the night itself, rolled out from the direction of the coal yard, swallowing the street. It was the same tactic from Red Mesa, but magnified. The smoke clinging to the heavy, wet air, creating an impenetrable wall of blackness. Then the gunshots came, muffled by the snow and the smoke, their flashes brief, disorienting sparks in the gloom. One of the deputies cried out and fell. The other returned fire blindly into the rolling black cloud. Sheriff Hale shoved Maddox and Ransom to the ground, shouting for everyone to take cover. Ash reacted on pure instinct. He shoved Abigail back toward the relative safety of a narrow gap between two stationary freight cars, yelling for her and Leah to stay down. Henry laid down covering fire, his shots methodical and controlled, aimed at the muzzle flashes he could glimpse in the suffocating smoke. A figure emerged from the fog, a man dressed in dark, heavy winter gear, moving with a calm, deadly purpose. It was not a brawler or a drunk. It was a professional. Maddox's last, most dangerous piece on the board. He fired, and the second deputy went down. Ash raised his own pistol, but his view was obscured by the swirling smoke and the panicked figure of Cyrus Maddox. who was scrambling away from the lawmen and toward the perceived safety of the rail yard. It was Ransom who saw the true threat. The dark-clad gunman ignored the deputies. His target was Ash. He raised his pistol, taking careful aim at the man who had brought him down. In that instant, Cole Ransom made his final choice. He was a man who had lived his life by a brutal, selfish code. But in the end, some rusted fragment of honor remained. He could not stand and watch the man who had shown him a flicker of mercy be shot down. With a guttural roar, still in handcuffs, he launched himself sideways, a clumsy, desperate tackle, slamming into the gunman just as he fired. The shot went wide. The gunman, thrown off balance, shoved Ransom away and fired again, this time at point-blank range. Ransom grunted, the sound a dull thud, and collapsed into the snow, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his chest. He fell at the edge of the billowing smoke, half in the world, half out. The gunman turned his attention back to Ash, but the moment was gone. Henry's next shot caught the man in the arm, forcing him to retreat back into the oily darkness. The world was a maelstrom of smoke, snow, and confusion. Ash saw Abigail, who had been pushed back by the force of the chaos, now trapped between two long coal cars, the narrow space a potential dead end. The gunman had vanished into the smoke in that same direction. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Ash's warrior calm. He sprinted toward the freight cars, shouting her name. He plunged into the black, stinging fog, his eyes watering, his lungs burning. It was like being underwater, disoriented, with danger lurking in every shadow. He heard her voice, a shout of warning, and then the deafening roar of a shotgun blast from deeper within the rail yard. She was fighting back. He found her pressed against the cold steel of a rail car, the small shotgun held at the ready. She was safe, for the moment. Relief washed over him, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He grabbed her arm, pulling her along, telling her they had to get out of the smoke. As they emerged from the thickest part of the cloud, they saw him, Ransom, lying in the snow, his breathing shallow. Ash knelt beside him. Ransom's eyes fluttered open, a flicker of the old defiance still there, but it was fading fast. He coughed, a wet, ragged sound. His cuffed hands fumbled at his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded, oil-stained letter. He pressed it into Ash's hand, his fingers surprisingly strong. "Maddox's own hand," he rasped, his voice a bare whisper. "He made me write it all down. Insurance, in case he ever turned on me." His gaze found Ash's, and in it, Ash saw a flicker of something that looked like peace. He had made one last, true bet, and he had won. His eyes glazed over, and the last breath left his body. There was no time to mourn or to process. The gunman was still out there. Ash tucked the letter inside his coat and pulled Abigail toward the only cover available, a long, high wooden bridge that spanned a deep, frozen ravine, used to move ore cars from one side of the yard to the other. The bridge was a skeleton of black timbers against the white snow, and its surface was a treacherous sheet of ice. As they reached the near side, the gunman appeared on the far end, blocking their path. He was a silhouette against the snowy darkness, a final guardian of Maddox's crumbling empire. Ash pushed Abigail behind one of the thick support trestles. He told her to stay there. This was his fight. The two men faced each other across the 50 yards of icy planking. The wind howled through the ravine below, whipping snow across the bridge. It was a duel not just of speed and aim, but of balance and will. Ash felt the old, familiar anger rise within him. The rage for his people, for the stolen land, for the life lost at Wieldy. It would be so easy to give in to it, to make this a killing. But he saw Abigail's face. He felt the weight of the law they had fought so hard to uphold. He would not become the thing he was fighting. He would end this, but he would end it on his own terms. The gunman fired first, his shot accurate, splintering the wood just inches from Ash's head. Ash returned fire, But he was not aiming for the man's chest. He was aiming for the ice at his feet. The bullet chipped the surface, and the gunman slipped, his second shot going wild. He recovered his footing, his face a mask of cold fury. He began to advance, moving slowly, carefully, across the ice. Ash did the same, the two of them closing the distance like wolves circling on a frozen lake. They were 20 feet apart when the gunman lunged, choosing to close the distance for a final, decisive shot. But Ash was ready. As the man slid forward, Ash stomped down hard with his heel on the edge of a loose plank. The other end of the board flew up, striking the gunman's leg, shattering his balance completely. He cried out, his arms flailing, and his pistol flew from his grasp, skittering across the ice and over the edge into the ravine below. He landed hard on his back, the air driven from his lungs. Ash was on him in an instant, his own pistol pressed to the man's forehead. The gunman stared up at him, his eyes wide with the certainty of death. The wind howled, the snow fell. Ash looked down at the man, the last instrument of Maddox's violence, and he made his choice. He did not pull the trigger. He pulled his arm back and, with the same controlled force he had used on Ransom, he struck the man, rendering him unconscious. He stood up, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Justice, not vengeance. He turned to see Henry and Sheriff Hale at the end of the bridge, their own weapons drawn. They had secured Maddox, who now stood between them, his face a ruin of disbelief and utter defeat. It was over. Ash walked back across the treacherous, icy bridge, a man who had crossed the chasm between two worlds and had not lost his balance. He went to Abigail, his hand finding hers, his grip firm and steady. The violence was done. The last shot had been fired. All that was left was the quiet falling of the snow and the heavy, undeniable weight of the truth in his pocket. When the great blizzard finally broke, it was as if the world was being born anew. The snow melted under a sun of astonishing brilliance, and the high mountain passes, once choked with impassable drifts, became roaring torrents of meltwater. The sound of the stamp mills resumed its thunderous chorus, but it no longer felt like a shout of conquest. It sounded like a heartbeat, the rhythm of a town getting back to the business of living. With the clear passes came the law. Federal marshals, grim-faced and efficient, arrived from Denver to take custody of Cyrus Maddox and his last surviving gunman. The trial, held in a larger, more formal federal courtroom, was a foregone conclusion. Ransom's deathbed letter, a damning confession written in Maddox's own imperious hand, was irrefutable. Coupled with the testimony of the captured gunman, the forged contracts, and the weight of public opinion from Silverton, the verdict was swift and decisive. Cyrus Maddox, the man who had moved mountains and bent territories to his will, was found guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and a list of other crimes that would ensure he would never again see the outside of a federal penitentiary. The Iron Snake had been decapitated. The news traveled by telegraph, a series of triumphant clicks and dashes spreading across the territory. The fraudulent contracts were declared null and void. The Territorial Council, facing a scandal of monumental proportions, publicly committed to a new era of fair and transparent negotiations with the Diné and other tribal nations. Justice, it turned out, was not just a word in a book. It was a foundation, hard-won and built to last. The return to Willow Creek was quiet. The land itself seemed different, softer. The snowmelt had given rise to a tentative fuzz of new green grass on the plains, a fragile promise growing in the red dust. Ash, Abigail, and Henry rode not as fugitives, but as architects of a new reality. The story of the trial in Silverton had outpaced them, arriving on the telegraph wires and spreading through the town like a prairie fire. There were no parades, no grand celebrations. That was not the way of Willow Creek. But the change was palpable. It was in the way people met their eyes in the street. The smirks and whispers that had once followed Abigail were gone, replaced by nods of profound, almost reverent, respect. The suspicious glances that had always trailed Ash had been supplanted by a hesitant but genuine curiosity. Abigail did not return to the small, stuffy schoolhouse in the center of town. She had a different vision now. She used the savings she had offered to Ash, along with a modest fund raised by the grateful citizens of Silverton, to purchase a small plot of land down by the San Juan River. It was a place that belonged neither to the town nor to the Navajo lands, but rested peacefully in between. There, with Henry's expertise in construction and Ash's tireless labor, they built a new school. It was a simple structure of adobe and pine, with large windows that let in the vast, open light of the plains. It was not just a building, it was a bridge. Her first students were a small, mixed group, the children of the white ranchers and merchants, Josiah Pike's son among them, the children of the handful of black families who worked the ranches and the livery, Henry's own young nephew, and, to the astonishment of many, a small group of Diane children, brought each morning by their parents who had heard of the teacher who spoke the truth and honored their ways. Abigail taught them reading and arithmetic, but she also taught them something more. She hung Leah Benali's woven blankets on the walls, teaching the stories they held. She taught that a person's worth was not in the color of their skin or the language of their parents, but in the strength of their character. Ash did not ride on. The wanderlust that had defined his life had been replaced by a different kind of pull, the gravity of a place, of a purpose. He was no longer a man adrift between worlds, he was a man building a new one. He used his knowledge of the land not to guide strangers, but to find a deep, reliable source of water. He dug a well, its stone walls cool and solid, its water a blessing to the small, growing community around the school. Beside it, he and Henry built a small way station, a livery and smithy, a place for travelers to rest and repair. It was a place of connection, of service. One afternoon, as Ash was fitting a new shoe to a horse, a familiar figure rode up. It was Chibigay, his face as serene and timeless as the mesas behind him. He dismounted and watched Ash work, his dark eyes taking in the schoolhouse, the well, the children of three peoples playing together in the yard. He did not need Leah to translate his thoughts. He placed a hand on Ash's shoulder, a gesture of profound approval. He looked from Ash to the schoolhouse where Abigail stood in the doorway, and then to the well. He smiled. A rare and beautiful thing. The boy has kept his balance, he said in his own language, and Ash understood. He had found Hozo, not in the solitude of the wilderness, but here, in the difficult, hopeful space between people. The healing of the community was a slow, quiet process, marked by small, significant moments. One day, Sheriff Hale walked down to the new well where Ash was watering his horse. The lawman had a different look in his eyes now, the weary defensiveness replaced by a clear, steady humility. He stood before Ash for a long moment, the silence broken only by the creak of the well pulley. He said he was sorry. He had judged Ash by the color of his skin, by the prejudices he had grown up with. He had been wrong. He held out his hand. Ash looked at the offered hand, then at the man's face. He saw the truth of the apology in the sheriff's eyes. He wiped his own hand on his trousers and shook it. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, for there was nothing to forgive. It was an act of acceptance, of two men agreeing to start a new story. The whispers about Abigail Turner finally died. No one called her the Virgin of Willow Creek anymore. The name had lost its power, its edge of mockery. It had become, in the story of the trial, a badge of honor. And now, it was retired, placed in the town's memory like a pressed flower in a book. They called her Miss Turner, and when they said it, it sounded like a title, a term of the deepest respect for the woman who had faced down an empire and had chosen to come back and teach their children. As the season turned toward summer, a celebration was held on the grassy field beside the new school. It was not a formal event. It was simply a gathering. Martha Whitcomb brought pies. Josiah Pike rolled out a barrel of cider. Abigail, with the help of her students, had baked trays of sweet cornbread. As the sun set, casting a golden light over the land, a fiddler from one of the ranches began to play. A lively, foot-stomping tune. People began to dance, their laughter mingling with the music. Then, a different sound joined in. A group of dine men who had come with chibigay began to play their hand drums, a beat as steady and ancient as the river beside them. For a moment, the two sounds, the fiddle and the drums, were separate. A hesitant conversation between two worlds. But then, slowly, miraculously, they began to find a shared rhythm. The fiddle softened its pace. The drums found a lighter, quicker beat. They wove together, creating a new kind of music, a sound that was neither one thing nor the other, but something unique, something shared. Ash stood with Abigail by the well, watching the dancers, listening to the music. The light from the bonfire flickered on the racks where Leia's students were learning to weave, their first small rugs, simple but vibrant, hanging to dry. The woven threads, like the music, like the people, were beginning to tell a single, hopeful story. Justice was not just a verdict delivered in a cold courtroom. It was this. It was the warmth of a shared fire, the taste of a neighbor's bread, the sound of a new song. It was the slow, patient, and beautiful work of learning to live together. The summer night was a benediction, a warm, gentle breeze, carrying the scent of sweetgrass and damp earth, drifted up from the banks of the San Juan River. Above, the sky was a vast, deep bowl of indigo, so clear that the river of the Milky Way seemed to flow just beyond arm's reach. The world was quiet, the frantic struggles of the past year having subsided into a deep and abiding peace. The only sounds were the gentle murmur of the river, the chirping of crickets in the new grass, and the distant, happy sound of children's laughter from the small community that had taken root by the school. Ash and Abigail sat together on a wide, flat slab of rock that overlooked the valley, a place they had come to think of as their own, the moon. A perfect silver disk bathed the landscape in a soft, ethereal light. They did not need to speak. Their shared silence was a language of its own, woven from the threads of 1,000 shared moments of terror and triumph. He had been working on the foundation for their house, a small cabin to be built on the rise just above the school. His hands, resting on his knees, were calloused and strong. The hands of a man who builds things. She rested her head against his shoulder. Her body relaxed. All the tension of the long trail finally gone. The ache in her own shoulder was a distant memory, a faint scar that was part of their story. She finally broke the quiet, her voice a soft murmur that blended with the sounds of the night. She said she had seen a picture in a magazine once, of a railroad baron's house back east. She called it a castle, a great, monstrous thing of stone and turrets, with 100 windows that looked down on everything. Ash nodded, his gaze fixed on the river below, a silver ribbon in the moonlight. He knew of such houses. They were built to declare a man's power, to separate him from the land he had conquered. They were fortresses of greed. Abigail traced a pattern on the back of his hand with her finger. She said their house would not be like that. It would be small, just 2 rooms, maybe 3. It would be built of pine from the mountains and mud from the river. It would not be a castle. It would be a home. It would have a large window, she said, one that faced east, so they could watch the sun rise together every morning. He turned his head, his dark hair brushing her cheek. He said, a window that faces the dawn is a good thing. It is a reminder that every day is a new beginning. They fell silent again. The image of the small house hanging in the air between them, a dream that was already taking root in the earth. The future was no longer a dangerous, unknown territory to be survived, but a home to be built, a life to be shared. She thought back to that cold, desperate night in the Chuska Mountains, the night the world had shifted on its axis. The memory was as clear as the stars above them. The flickering firelight, the scent of snow on the wind, the weight of their confessions. She remembered his words, spoken like a vow into the heart of the fire. She repeated them now, her voice a soft whisper. The Navajo warrior was hired to guard the virgin. Ash finished the sentence, his own voice a low, resonant murmur that was for her alone. He took the job for the rest of his life. The words were the same, but their meaning had been transformed. The promise of a hired guard, a man bound by a temporary contract, had dissolved. In its place was the unbreakable covenant of a husband, a partner, a man whose life was now inextricably woven with hers. The name the town had used to mock her, to isolate her, had become the cornerstone of their story, a symbol not of her solitude, but of the moment their two lives had become one. Abigail's hand went to her wrist, her fingers closing over the smooth, familiar shape of the turquoise bracelet. It had been her constant companion through the dust and the fear, a small piece of the sky to ward off the darkness. It was a symbol of protection, Leia had told her, but she knew now that her true protection had not come from a stone. It had come from the man beside her. Ash saw the gesture. He took her hand in his thumb gently stroking the silver setting of the stone. He looked from the bracelet to her eyes, and in their green depths he saw the reflection of the starry sky, the river, the whole of the world they had fought for. He said, "We keep each other, as the earth keeps the water." His words were as simple and profound as the land itself. It was the deepest truth he knew. Theirs was not a love of grand declarations or fleeting passions. It was a love like the earth and the water, a bond of necessity, of sustenance, of a balance so perfect and natural it needed no further explanation. She was his home. He was her strength. Together, they made a world. From the valley below, the sound of a child's laughter pealed through the quiet air, clear and joyful. The school was thriving. More families, both white and Daini, had arrived. Drawn to this small pocket of peace, this community built on the radical idea of mutual respect. The laughter was the sound of their future, a testament to the fact that the seeds they had planted were taking root and growing strong. Then, another sound drifted on the night air, faint and far away. It was a train whistle, a lonely, mournful cry from the other side of the mesas. A year ago, that sound would have been a harbinger of violence, the call of the iron snake that had tried to devour the land and its people. It had been a symbol of a ruthless, unstoppable force. But tonight, it was just a sound. The whistle no longer held the power of menace. The railroad was still there, a fact of the new world, but it was no longer an instrument of a single man's greed. It was a tool, and now, governed by fair laws and watchful eyes, it could be a tool for good. That distant train might be carrying lumber for a new house, or books for Abigail's school, or a doctor to tend to the sick. The technology that had brought so much pain now held the potential for connection, for progress that did not require conquest. Ash and Abigail listened to the sound until it faded into the vast silence of the high plains. They did not need to speak of its new meaning. They both understood. The past had been faced. Its ghosts laid to rest not by vengeance, but by truth. The future was not a destination they had to ride to. It was here, in this moment, under the wide and benevolent sky. It was in the quiet strength of their hands, clasped together in the moonlight. It was a promise, kept and renewed with every beat of their shared hearts. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.